Well, welcome to 10 Minute Record Reviews, episode 114, and today I'm going to talk about Marvin Gaye's masterpiece from 1971, What's Going On? And what I have here is an early 70s, unknown year, Canadian pressing, a Unipack sleeve. So this album is nothing like anything that Marvin Gaye really produced elsewhere in his career. It's a concept album, it's a protest album, it's a devout album, it's a profoundly groovy album. It's also very much a piece of art which really has to be understood as an album because the music flows as a concept piece. There are some singles that are released in edited form from this record, but you really don't, I think, get the full sense of it unless you listen to this as a coherent whole. As the 1960s had worn on, Marvin Gaye was dealing with addictions. His longtime singing partner Tammy Terrell was terminally ill. His marriage was falling apart. His brother was in Vietnam and sending him home letters, and this was profoundly affecting Marvin. He reevaluates his music. He's thinking more and more about the state of American society. In 1970, Tammy Terrell dies, and he basically retreats at that point to his house. He does release an album, but he refuses to tour. He's just kind of gone into a shell. This time he also returns to religion and becomes increasingly spiritual in his outlook. But the genesis of this album actually doesn't have much to do with Marvin Gaye. A member of the Four Tops, Gaye's label mates, a guy called Obie Benson, happens to be in Berkeley in 1969, and he observes the so-called Bloody Thursday crackdown by police and anti-war protesters, which sees Governor Ronald Reagan order armed police in to break up demonstrations. Police end up using live ammunition and actually killing somebody. Following this, Benson and Al Cleveland, who was an in-house Motown songwriter, write a song based on the incident, based on Benson's experience of it, and Benson brings it to his bandmates, the Four Tops, and they turn it down. They say this is too political. They offer it to Joan Baez, and Baez is uninterested. Benson then offers it to Gaye. Gaye likes it, and he takes it, he makes some changes to the music, and also adds his own lyrics. With this song, Marvin thinks he's really onto something that's really in tune with where he is at. So he goes to see Berry Gordy, the head of Motown Records, and Gordy basically says, give your head a shake, you're going to ruin your career. This is crazy. Why would you do this? Why would you make a protest album? This is not a good idea. So Marvin's been rebuffed, but he doesn't give up, and he has a lot of sway at Motown because of all the hits he's had, notwithstanding the fact that he's not the boss. So in June 1970, he gets some studio time in Studio A in the so-called Snake Pit, which was downstairs at the famous Hitsville, USA building, and he goes and produces and records the song himself. For musicians, he calls on a number of the famous Funk Brothers ensemble who provided so much backing for the Motown hits of the late 60s. And through the connections of David Vanderpit, the Motown arranger, they managed to bring in the Detroit Symphony Orchestra for horn and string accompaniment. The song, of course, is What's Going On, which would be the title track to the album, but at this point, it's not smooth sailing. Berry Gordy at this point was in the process of moving Motown's headquarters from Detroit out to LA. And in September, Marvin takes the polished song out to Berry and plays it for him. And Berry says, quote, "This is the worst thing I've ever heard in my life." He said it was too jazzy, too protesty. The other Motown suits all lined up behind Gordy and said they didn't like it either. But there were a few glimmers of light here. A few people at Motown actually liked the song. These, of course, include Stevie Wonder, but critically also a couple of suits. The VP of Sales, a guy called Barney Ailes, and an A&R guy called Harry Balk. Working under the radar, Ailes and Balk managed to get 100,000 copies of the edited single, What's Going On, to stores in January 1971. It goes to number 1 on the Soul chart and number 2 on Billboard. So understandably, Gordy's kind of flabbergasted but delighted, and he says, okay, Marvin, now we need an album to back this up. We've got to capitalize on this. You have a month until the end of March to make this record. In fact, Marvin does it in only a couple of weeks. The remaining songs he'd written were very much of a piece with the debut single. They were spiritual, commonly in nature. They were very much focused on society, its breakdown, and people's caring for each other, concerned with the war, concerned with police brutality. And together with his collaborators, he hunkers down and he gets this album done in rapid time. Interestingly, of course, before and after this record, Marvin is famously a ladies' man in his presentation, his lyrics, and so on. Very love-oriented, often very sexually oriented lyrics, and this was just the nature of the guy. This, however, was not a love or sex-themed album. This was an album focused on society and spirituality and peace and togetherness. And so Marvin felt he had to get into the right space. So apparently, he would lock himself into a room for a couple of hours prior to singing and engage in some very frenetic self-abuse so that when he emerged, his mind would be pure and he could focus purely on the spiritual and political and social themes that he wanted to sing about. Anyway, regardless of the amount of onanism involved, the album was finished in a couple of weeks. Gaye then takes the master tapes out to LA and does a distinctly different mix from the original mix done in Detroit. Gordy is not sure about the album still because of the way the songs flow seamlessly from one to another. Is this going to work for hit singles and so on? But he decides he's second-guessed Marvin enough and says, no, let's release it as it is. And it becomes Motown's biggest selling album to date. As I've mentioned, this record is very much a concept album, all about a returning Vietnam vet who sees things going on in America at the time and reflects on the nature of people's relationship to each other, their relationship to God, and so on. The title track kicks off the album, and it's set at the party where this Vietnam vet is returning, and you can hear all this chatter. Amongst the people chattering are actually a couple of members who were then playing for the Detroit Lions, Mel Farr and Lem Barney. This is a multi-layered track. It's almost a wall of sound around this excellent bass line that weaves all the way through the song. The lyrics, of course, are this timeless plea for love and understanding, and they're so famous that Nelson Mandela actually quoted from them when he was freed in 1990 and came to the United States and made a big speech in Detroit. On this song and elsewhere in the album as well, you can hear Gaye singing the lead vocal twice, and it isn't always in unison. He's not purely double-tracked in unison with himself, the same way that you sometimes get on the Beatles records. The reason this happens is because Gaye had asked to compare two different versions of the lead he had sung, and the engineers had accidentally combined them into one track. And when he heard it, he thought, oh, I love this effect, and they kept it for much of the album, so you hear this here, and you hear it elsewhere as well. The second fluke is that famous little piece of alto sax, which kicks off the song just as you hear all the chatter in the party. This happens when the sax player, a guy called Eli Fontaine, is just kind of doing some runs warming up during a rehearsal. It doesn't know the tape's rolling, and they decide to keep it. What's Going On is eventually blended into What's Happening Brother, which is another song where the bass is fundamental to the feeling and the energy of the track. His co-writer in this song is a guy called James Nix, who actually was the elevator operator at Motown. And what he would do, because he would see all kinds of famous artists coming and going in the elevator, is he'd give them song lyrics or ideas for songs he'd come up with. Most people didn't take him seriously, but Gaye did, and he used his ideas here and also in two other tracks in this album, and Nix receives full writing credit in all three tracks. Next song, Flying High in the Friendly Sky, is a lament about heroin addiction. The music then blends into Save the Children, which is kind of a spoken word piece, or at least that's how it starts, but eventually Gaye comes in doubling the lyric by singing along with the rap. This is all about Gaye's beautiful voice. You get this funky little coda, and then it segues directly into God is Love, one of the most spiritual pieces on the record, one of the most spiritual pieces that Marvin recorded his whole career. The final song on the side is Mercy, Mercy Me, The Ecology. This is a brilliant song. Of course, it was a really big hit. Gaye has a number of different musical personae that he uses. One is the falsetto singing, another is the kind of lover man approach that he uses on some tracks, not very many. And then there's this one, which is a very gentle, almost inward-looking kind of lyric. And the vocal choral stylings in the outro are so cool. A really fascinating piece of work. Amazing that this was pulled together in just a couple of days, effectively. Side 2 starts with Right On, which is another excellent track. Interestingly, it's much more stripped down, at least at the beginning. There's this great little piece of piano, there's a washboard, there's this jazzy flute, the bass is just incredible. You have this gentle little coda with strings, which ends up having this wild, overblown sax laid over top of it. And then at the very end, this wicked drumming with a flute solo laid over top. I would have loved so much more of that. That's the longest song on the album, and then it blends into Holy Holy, one of the really spiritual songs on the album. This is lovely, and it sets us up for what I think is the best song on the whole record, the last track, Inner City Blues. That famous bass riff, and incidentally, if you haven't heard Grover Washington's version of this song, please seek it out because it takes that bass riff and just makes a monster out of it. By any standard, What's Going On is an excellent album. This comes as close as any pop or soul album ever did to that mixture of righteous rage and spirituality, which was the very best that jazz had to offer in the 1960s and 70s. And so I think you had to put this up on the same shelf as Coltrane's A Love Supreme or Archie Shepp's Attica Blues. The album has a brilliant suite in the first side. The second side is less cohesive musically, but if anything, I think the songs are even stronger. Funnily enough, in all the time it took to make this record, between the time that Benson, the songwriter, observed the violence at Berkeley to its release in 1971, Gaye almost misses his moment because some of the lyrical themes are just about out of date by this point. But he got in under the wire. He never did anything like this again. After a little bit of a detour into a blaxploitation soundtrack, he then gets right back into sexy music after this, which was great, but a totally different trip. What he did leave us with is this totally inspirational album, one which reveals its secrets gradually, listen after listen, and it's clearly a 5 out of 5 for me.